The gates of Fort Bragg loomed like something carved out of stone and judgment. Private Elena Carter stood at attention with the other recruits, but nothing about her posture matched the confidence of the soldiers around her. The morning air was cold, sharp, and unforgiving, like the base itself was testing her before anyone else bothered to speak. Rows of new recruits stretched across the training yard. Some cracked their knuckles, others whispered jokes, and a few stared forward with the kind of arrogance that came from believing they already belonged. Elena didn't. She knew it. And worse, everyone else seemed to know it too. Sergeant Major Harlan walked in front of them slowly, boots hitting the ground like measured warnings. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every recruit straightened up the moment he passed, as if discipline itself was walking by. His eyes stopped on clipboards more than faces, but when they did land on a person, it felt like a verdict. When he finally stopped in front of Elena, the entire line seemed to tighten. He looked her up and down once. Then again, like he was checking a mistake. "You're Private Carter," he said flatly. "Yes, Sergeant Major." A pause. The kind that doesn't test patience, it tests worth. "You're not what we requested for advanced selection." The words didn't sound angry, that made them worse. They sounded final. A few recruits nearby shifted. Someone smirked quietly behind her shoulder. Elena didn't react. She had learned early that reacting was what people wanted. It gave them control. Silence took it away. "I understand, Sergeant Major," she said evenly. Harlan tilted his head slightly. "Do you?" "Yes, sir." Another pause, longer this time. Then he closed his clipboard. "You're reassigned to the Auxiliary Training Unit." A ripple moved through the recruits. Everyone knew what that meant. The rejection group. The overflow. The ones they didn't expect to survive. Harlan turned slightly so others could hear him. "That unit exists to filter out those who can't handle real training. If you quit, you leave. If you break, you leave. If you die," he paused, eyes cold, "you were never meant to be here anyway." No emotion, no drama. Just policy. Elena nodded once. "Understood, Sergeant Major." That was all. But Harlan didn't move immediately. His eyes lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. Then he stepped past her. Just like that, she was erased from the main group. The rejection unit. The auxiliary training unit wasn't a place. It was a warning. The barracks were older, farther from the main field, and quieter in a way that felt intentional. The paint was faded, the equipment less polished, the instructors less patient. The recruits there weren't beginners anymore. They were survivors of rejection. And they wore that fact like a bruise. Elena stood in line again later that afternoon, this time with a smaller group. Fewer voices, fewer smiles, more silence. A drill instructor walked in, Staff Sergeant Cade Mercer. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "Listen carefully," he said. "You're here because someone decided you weren't worth their time." He paced slowly. "Now I'm going to find out if they were right." The first week was brutal in a quiet way. No dramatic speeches. No encouragement. Just pressure. 10-mile runs before sunrise. Obstacle courses that changed without warning. Carry drills with gear heavier than most recruits expected to lift. Elena didn't stand out. Not at first. She wasn't the fastest runner. Not the strongest climber. Not the loudest voice in formation. But she did something most people didn't notice right away. She didn't break rhythm. When others sped up and collapsed later, she stayed steady. When others slowed to recover and fell behind, she adjusted without panic. She treated exhaustion like information, not defeat. And in that unit, that was unusual. Still, nobody cared. Not yet. The mockery begins. By the third day, The unit had already started sorting itself informally. Strong personalities rose, weak ones got pushed aside, and the quiet ones were tested first. During hand-to-hand combat training, recruits were paired randomly. That's when Alina met him. Private Dawson Tank Miller. He was larger than most, built like he had been carved out of impatience and protein shakes. He cracked his neck as he stepped into the ring, rolling his shoulders like he already knew how this would end. He looked at Alina and smiled. "Don't worry," he said loudly enough for nearby recruits to hear. "I won't embarrass you too badly." A few chuckles came from the side. Alina said nothing. She tightened her gloves. Staff Sergeant Mercer stood at the edge of the mat. "No rules except control. Go." The whistle blew. Tank moved first, fast, direct, confident. A straight strike meant to end it quickly. Alina stepped aside. Clean. Minimal movement. No wasted energy. Tank frowned slightly. He swung again, harder this time. She blocked, redirected, shifted. The sound of impact echoed through the yard. Not a win. Not a loss. Just resistance. Tank's smile faded. "Stop moving around," he snapped. "Fight properly." Alina didn't answer. He charged again. This time he overcommitted. Alina saw it before it happened, not faster, just earlier. She stepped in, turned his arm, shifted his balance. In less than a second, he hit the ground. A sharp, controlled fall. Silence followed. Not applause. Not cheers. Just stillness. Tank lay there for a moment, surprised more than hurt. Then he slowly got up and looked at her differently. Not with respect. Not yet. With calculation. Mercer didn't react either. He simply said, "Reset." But the moment had already spread through the unit. Something unexpected had happened. And in places like this, unexpected things always get tested again. Harder. The isolation that builds pressure. That night, Alina sat outside the barracks steps. The base was quieter here. No polished parade grounds. No distant ceremony drills. Just the sound of tired recruits trying not to think too loudly. She cleaned her gear methodically. Each motion precise. A shadow fell beside her. Private Mason Reed. He didn't sit right away, just watched. "You shouldn't have done that," he said finally. Alina didn't look up. "Done what?" "Made him fall." A pause. "Now everyone will target you." She tightened a strap. They already were. Mason hesitated. "This place doesn't reward that kind of attention." Alina finally looked at him. "Then it rewards the wrong things." That shut him up for a moment. Far away, floodlights flickered over the main base. A faint siren sounded, but it was distant, routine. Or so it seemed. Mason stood. "Something feels off tonight." Alina looked toward the lights. Not afraid. Just observant. "Something always does," she said quietly. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, she didn't feel like she was being rejected. She felt like she was being positioned. The night at Fort Bragg didn't begin with warning. It began with absence. No announcement, no drill siren, no sudden chaos. Just a strange, unnatural quiet, like the entire base had been placed under glass. Private Alina Carter noticed it first. She was still outside the barracks steps, tightening the last strap on her gear. The routine should have felt normal by now, end of training, soldiers moving in and out, distant noise from the motor pool, radios crackling in rhythm. But tonight everything felt delayed. Even footsteps sounded softer. Even voices didn't carry the same distance. Mason Reed stood a few feet away, scanning the dark edges of the yard. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Alina paused. She listened. Nothing. That was the problem. There should have been something. Wind, engines, commands, movement. Instead, it felt like the base was holding its breath. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and shut off. Blackout. For half a second, Fort Bragg disappeared. Then emergency red lights snapped on, but weak, uneven, flickering like they were struggling to stay alive. A distant metallic crash echoed from the east sector, followed by another. Then silence again. Then, boom! The ground shook. Not a training explosion, not a controlled demolition. A real impact. The kind that doesn't belong inside a secured military base. Instantly, alarms finally triggered. But even they sounded distorted. Breach DATSCTD, East Storage, all UNITS. The rest cut into static. Mason stepped back. What is happening? Alina didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the far side of the base. Not where the explosion was, but where movement was not supposed to be possible. They're inside already, she said quietly. Command breakdown. Soldiers poured out of barracks in confusion, half-armored, some without helmets, others still adjusting gear straps. Confusion spreads faster than orders. Sergeant Major Harlan appeared through the chaos with a rifle already in hand, shouting into a radio that only gave static. Command, respond. We have a breach. Repeat, we have a breach. Nothing. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. That's when his expression changed slightly. Not fear. Control slipping. Form up, he barked at nearby soldiers. Perimeter defense now. But the perimeter was already compromised. A second explosion hit the fuel storage area. A fireball lit the sky for less than a second before smoke swallowed everything. The base went from controlled military facility to fragmented disaster in under a minute. And still no clear enemy in sight. Alina sees the pattern. Most soldiers reacted to noise. Alina reacted to silence between noises. She crouched behind a low barrier, scanning the dark edges of the yard. Mason, she said sharply. He dropped beside her instantly. What? Don't look at the explosions, she said. Look between them. He frowned. What does that mean? Alina pointed. Not at fire. Not at smoke. But at movement. Shadows shifting in coordinated timing, too clean to be random, too precise to be panic. They're not attacking randomly, she said. They're controlling sections. Mason's voice dropped. Controlling us. Alina nodded once. Yes. Another explosion echoed closer. This time near the armory sector. That changed everything. If the armory fell, they would lose weapons, ammunition, and response capability. And the attackers knew it. The enemy finally appears. The first visual contact wasn't dramatic. No loud entrance. No announcement. Just motion in the dark. A silhouette cross between two burning structures, fast, low, efficient. Then another. Then three more. Not rushing. Not panicking. Moving like they had rehearsed this exact environment. A soldier nearby raised his rifle and fired blindly into the smoke. Gunfire cracked through the base. Immediately, return fire answered, but not from everywhere. From specific angles. Calculated. Controlled. Contact, someone shouted. That was all it took. The entire base fractured into panic. Chaos spreads faster than bullets. Harlan tried to regroup forces near the central yard, waving soldiers into positions. But coordination was collapsing. Radios failed. Units lost contact. Groups formed and dissolved within seconds. A squad on the west side went silent after entering smoke cover. Another retreated without orders, shouting that they couldn't see anything. Fear began to replace structure. And once fear replaces structure in a military environment, everything becomes individual survival. Mason looked at Alina. "We're outmatched," he said. Alina didn't deny it. But she also didn't agree. Instead, she said, "We're just unorganized." Mason stared at her. "That's your takeaway right now." Alina checked her magazine calmly. "They're coordinated," she said, "which means they're following a system. And if we understand the system, we can disrupt it." Mason shook his head. "People are dying." Alina finally looked at him. "And reacting emotionally won't stop that." That silence hit harder than the gunfire. First real decision. Another explosion rocked the communications tower. Lights across the base dimmed further. Whatever control remained was disappearing fast. Command structure was collapsing. Sergeant Harlan's voice cut through briefly over a backup radio channel. "Fall back to Central Command. Hold until reinforcement arrives." But Alina knew what that really meant. Wait. And lose more ground. Mason grabbed her arm. "We should fall back too." Alina looked toward the burning armory sector. Then toward the shadow movement again. Then toward the soldiers breaking formation. Finally, she made a decision that didn't match protocol. "We're not falling back," she said. Mason blinked. "Then what are we doing?" Alina tightened her grip on her rifle. "We're going where they're organizing." Mason's face went pale. "That's suicide." Alina stood. "No," she corrected. "That's the only place this ends." She stepped forward into the smoke. Not toward safety. Not toward command. But toward the structure behind the chaos. And in that moment, she stopped being the rejected recruit and became the one person moving like she understood the battlefield better than anyone else on it. The smoke wasn't just thick, it was alive. It rolled across Fort Bragg like a living barrier, swallowing light, sound, and direction. Every step Alina Carter took into it felt like stepping further away from order itself. Behind her, Mason Reed hesitated. "Carter, this is insane," he called quietly. Alina didn't stop. "If we stay where they expect us," she replied, "we die where they expect us." Then she disappeared into the smoke. For a moment, Mason stood frozen. Then he followed. Inside the collapse. The deeper they moved, the less it felt like a military base and more like a broken machine. Flashing red lights barely pierced the haze. Shadows moved between burning structures with terrifying discipline. These weren't random attackers. Every movement had spacing, timing, purpose. Alina crouched behind a damaged supply crate. She watched, counted, waited. "Three-person rotations," she whispered. Mason crouched beside her. "What?" "They're moving in cycles," she said. "No gaps, no hesitation. This isn't chaos, it's control." Another explosion echoed nearby, shaking debris loose from a collapsed wall. Mason wiped dust from his face. "So what are they controlling?" Alina didn't answer immediately, because she was starting to see it. Not just the movement, the structure. They weren't just attacking the base. They were mapping it in real time. A pattern beneath the fire. Alina shifted position, careful not to expose herself. Through the smoke, she saw it clearly now. Enemy units weren't spreading randomly. They were cutting the base into sections. East sector isolated. Armory sector secured. Communication tower neutralized. Central yard being compressed. Each explosion wasn't destruction for chaos. It was division for control. "They're splitting the base into zones," Alina said quietly. Mason frowned. Why? Elena's eyes narrowed. Because once everything is separated, she said, nothing can coordinate. A cold realization settled between them. This wasn't a raid. It was a surgical dismantling. First contact. A sudden crunch of gravel snapped Elena's focus. Too late. A shadow moved behind them. Contact, Mason started. Elena pulled him down instantly. A figure passed just 10 meters away, helmeted, tactical, silent. No shouting, no scanning wildly. Just movement. Professional. Mason's breathing became shallow. They're everywhere. Elena watched the patrol pass. Then she noticed something worse. The enemy wasn't just moving through the base. They were marking it. Small devices attached to walls, infrared tags, signal beacons. She recognized the pattern immediately. They're setting up targeting nodes, she whispered. Mason stared at her. Targeting what? Elena didn't answer right away. Because now she saw the real objective. And it wasn't the soldiers. The armory. Truth. A distant explosion lit the sky again, closer than before. The armory sector was burning. But something about it didn't feel like destruction. It felt like access. Elena grabbed Mason's sleeve. We're going to the armory, she said. Mason pulled back. That's where they are. Exactly. He stared at her like she had lost her mind. That's the most dangerous place on the entire base. Elena's voice stayed calm. And also the most important. Another burst of gunfire cracked through the smoke. Soldiers were retreating blindly now, some injured, some separated, all disoriented. The base wasn't defending itself anymore. It was dissolving. Elena stood. This is bigger than a raid, she said. They didn't come to fight us. Mason swallowed. Then what? Elena looked toward the burning armory. To take something that's already inside. The infiltration. They moved faster now. No longer hiding in place, hiding in motion. Elena led them through broken corridors of smoke and debris, avoiding open ground, using collapsed structures as cover. Every few seconds she paused, not to fear but to read. Footprints in ash. Heat direction. Sound delay. Mason noticed it. You're tracking them, he said. Elena didn't look back. I'm tracking the pattern. You're doing this like you've trained for it. A brief pause. I haven't, she said. That was the strange part. Everything she did looked like instinct, but it wasn't random. It was observation stacked on rapid deduction. They reached a fractured wall, overlooking the armory perimeter. What they saw made Mason stop, breathing for a second. The armory is already compromised. The armory wasn't just under attack. It was being dismantled. Enemy teams moved with precise coordination, cutting entry points, disabling exterior defense nodes, and securing interior access routes. But they weren't rushing in. They were waiting. For something. Elena narrowed her eyes. There, she said. Mason followed her gaze. A central transport vehicle sat near the armory entrance, heavily reinforced, already loaded with something. Something covered. Something important. That's what they came for, Elena said. Mason shook his head. We don't even know what it is. Elena's voice dropped. We don't need to know what it is, she said. We just need to know they can't leave with it. A pause. Then Mason asked the question he already feared the answer to. How do we stop them? Elena watched the enemy formation tighten. Then she said something that changed everything. We don't stop them. Mason turned sharply. What? We disrupt the extraction, she corrected. That's different. Another explosion rocked the far side of the base. Enemy movement increased. They were preparing to move. Elena adjusted her grip on her rifle, and for the first time since the attack began, she moved like someone stepping into command. Not because she was told to, because no one else was left who could see clearly enough to lead. The turn. A loud command echoed through enemy channels, short, clipped, final. The extraction was starting. Vehicles powered up. Units tightened formation. Smoke thickened as the armory perimeter collapsed further. Mason looked at Elena. "They're leaving in minutes." Elena nodded once. "Then we have minutes." She stepped forward. Not away from danger. Straight into its edge. And behind her, the rejected recruit from Fort Bragg stopped being a survivor and became a problem the enemy had not accounted for. The armory perimeter was collapsing fast. Smoke twisted through broken concrete like it was alive, and the sound of boots, enemy boots, was getting closer to the extraction point every second. Private Elena Carter crouched behind the fractured wall with Mason Reed beside her. Both of them were breathing slower now, not calm but controlled. There was no room left for panic. Panic had already burned through the base hours ago. Now there was only action. In the distance, the enemy convoy was fully visible. 2 armored transport vehicles. 1 central container between them. Heavily secured. Guarded by layered formations, moving with precise synchronization. "They're about to move," Mason whispered. Elena didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were locked on the formation. Not the weapons. Not the vehicles. The rhythm. "They're coordinated in cycles," she said quietly. "If we interrupt one cycle, the whole extraction slows." Mason frowned. "And if we do?" Elena finally looked at him. "Then they leave with whatever that is, and Fort Bragg becomes a crime scene instead of a base." A distant explosion shook the ground again. This time closer. The convoy was initiating movement. The decision point. Mason swallowed hard. "We can't take them head-on." Elena nodded once. "We don't." She reached into her tactical pouch and pulled out a small signal jammer module. Damaged, half-functional, something she had salvaged during the chaos earlier without explaining why. Mason stared at it. "You had that the whole time." "I found it," she corrected. "They were using structured communication nodes. I needed proof." He blinked. "Proof of what?" Elena checked the device. "That this isn't just a raid." Another pause. Then she added, "It's a controlled extraction operation, military grade, possibly private." Mason's face tightened. "Who the hell are they?" Elena didn't answer. Because right now, the answer didn't matter. Only interruption did. Into the fire line. The convoy began to move. Slow at first, then faster. Elena moved first. No hesitation. She dropped from cover and sprinted through broken terrain, using smoke pockets and destroyed structures as concealment. Mason followed seconds later, struggling to keep pace. Gunfire cracked in the distance. But not randomly. The enemy noticed pattern disruption immediately. "Elena," Mason shouted, "they see us." "I know," she said. She didn't slow down. That was the difference. Most soldiers reacted to being seen. Elena reacted to being timed. She counted the movement cycles of the enemy units as she ran. 3 seconds between sweeps. 2-second blind overlap near the convoy rear. Half-second gap at the left perimeter. That was enough. The first disruption. Elena slid behind a burned-out vehicle, just as enemy fire swept across the area she had been running through. Mason dropped beside her, breathing hard. "They're locking on fast," he said. Elena nodded, "because they're still synchronized." She activated the jammer. A faint pulse emitted. Nothing visible changed, but something critical broke. Enemy movement hesitation. Not much. Half a second. Then one unit shifted out of rhythm. That was all it took. The formation didn't collapse, but it stuttered. Mason noticed it instantly. They're slowing down. Elena watched carefully. Not slowing, she corrected, disinced. She stood again. That's our window. The armory collapse becomes opportunity. Chaos inside the base was still spreading. Remaining defenders were regrouping blindly, while enemy units were trying to compensate for lost coordination. But for the first time since the attack began, the enemy was no longer perfect. Elena moved closer to the convoy's blind side. Mason followed. "You're going to get us killed," he muttered. Elena didn't look back. "We were already in that position when this started," she said. "Now we're just changing the outcome." A sudden burst of gunfire forced them to drop again. Dust exploded around them. But Elena was already calculating. "They're protecting the container more than anything else," she said. "That means it's mobile priority." Mason frowned. So if it stops moving," she said, eyes narrowing, "everything around it panics." She turned to him. "Can you throw?" Mason blinked. "Throw what?" Elena handed him a compact flash disruptor, another improvised device. "Into their rear formation," she said. Mason hesitated. "That's insane." Elena didn't argue. She just said, "It's timed with their cycle gap." Another explosion echoed nearby. The convoy started accelerating. Time was running out. The throw. Mason took a breath he probably didn't need. Then he moved. He ran low, crossed a broken stretch of ground, and launched the device into the enemy rear cluster just as Elena had predicted. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a burst of blinding light and signal distortion erupted. Enemy comms fractured. One unit lost coordination. Then another. Then the rear formation collapsed out of rhythm. The convoy halted. Not fully, but enough. The chain reaction. Elena didn't wait. "Now," she said. She moved toward the edge of the convoy's blind perimeter, firing controlled bursts, not to eliminate but to force repositioning. Every shot pushed enemy units into reactive movement instead of structured formation. And reactive movement breaks timing. The convoy slowed further, then stopped. For the first time since the breach began, the extraction was no longer clean. Mason stared at the chaos unfolding. "You actually broke them," he said. Elena didn't respond immediately. Because she wasn't done. She was watching the central container. Still intact. Still secured. Still the objective. "It's not over," she said. "Final push." Enemy leadership finally reacted. Orders shouted across channels. Units began tightening again, but slower now, forced to rebuild structure under pressure. Elena saw it. "They're trying to reset formation," she said. "If they reset, we lose." Mason stepped forward. "So what do we do?" Elena looked at the convoy. Then at the burning base behind them. Then at the scattered soldiers trying to regroup. And finally, she made the final call. "We end the extraction." She sprinted forward, directly toward the convoy's central container. Gunfire erupted instantly. Mason followed without thinking anymore. Because at this point, there was no plan left. Only momentum. The save. Elena reached the convoy under heavy fire, sliding into cover beneath the central transport unit. She planted the jammer directly against the container lock system. A final pulse surged. The convoy system froze. Engine stuttered. Synchronization broke completely. Enemy units hesitated, just long enough for scattered base forces to finally regroup and respond. And that hesitation changed everything. Within minutes, surviving soldiers from Fort Bragg began countering disorganized enemy units, now forced into retreat instead of extraction. The operation collapsed, not with victory noise, but with failure. Controlled, clean, interrupted. Aftermath. By the time the smoke began to clear, the convoy was gone. Retreated. Abandoned extraction. Whatever had been inside the container was no longer their priority. They had lost control. Mason sat on the ground, exhausted. We did it. Elena stood quietly, watching the burning perimeter of the base. Not celebrating, just observing. Sergeant Major Harlan approached from a distance, slower than before. He looked at the destroyed armory zone, the scattered enemy remnants, the surviving units regrouping. Then he looked at Elena. Long silence. Finally, he said, "You weren't supposed to survive this." Elena met his gaze. "Neither was anyone else," she replied. Harlan didn't argue. For once, because the truth was visible everywhere. The rejected recruit hadn't just survived the night. She had redirected it. And Fort Bragg would never look at her or failure the same way again.